The Cold War, The Origins, Part 2. The Cold War is the name given to the rocky relationship and the battle of political philosophies primarily between the USA and the USSR after World War II. Again, the Cold War was not fought head-to-head between these two countries, but through other countries. The Cuban Missile Crisis, Korean conflict, the Vietnam War, Hungary, and the Berlin Wall being just some. For many, the growth in weapons of mass destruction, or nuclear weapons, was the scariest issue. The superpowers used spying, propaganda, diplomacy, and secret operations in their dealings with each other. Much of the world allied with one side or the other. In fact, until the Soviet Union finally broke up in 1991, the Cold War dictated not only US and Soviet foreign policy, but influenced world alliances as well. The history of the United States and the Soviet Union had been rocky from the start. The United States wouldn't even recognize the Soviet Union as a country in 1917. It wouldn't be until 1933 that the US finally would. Even during the war as allies, the US and Britain were upset that Stalin would enter a non-aggression pact with Hitler, and Stalin was upset that the Allies had not invaded Europe sooner to take the pressure off the Russian front. So by the end of the war, relations between the two grew even worse. The Cold War would be fought in Poland and Germany, Vietnam and Korea. It would be fought in Afghanistan and in countless countries through Central and South America. But it would never be directly fought between the United States and the Soviet Union, in part for fear of an all-out global nuclear war, destroying not just the two countries, but the entire world. So part 2 of Origins. Containment. US-Soviet relations continued to worsen in 1946 and 1947. An increasingly worried United States tried to offset the growing Soviet threat to Eastern Europe. President Truman adopted a foreign policy called containment. It was a policy directed at blocking Soviet influence and stopping the expansion of communism. Containment policies included forming alliances and helping weak countries resist Soviet advances. The Truman Doctrine. U.S. President Harry Truman developed policies that supported countries that rejected communism as a form of government. It was called the Truman Doctrine. It caused great controversy. Some domestic opponents objected to American interference in other nations' affairs. Others argued that the United States could not afford to carry on a global crusade against communism. The Truman Doctrine was first applied to both Greece and Turkey. Greece and Turkey were under threat of falling to communism. Truman and Congress sent them $400 million in aid to help the two countries resist. The Marshall Plan. Much of Western Europe lay in ruins after the war. There was also economic turmoil, a scarcity of jobs and food. In 1947, U.S. Secretary of State George Marshall proposed the United States give aid to needy countries in Europe. This assistance program, called the Marshall Plan, would provide food, machinery, and other materials to rebuild Western Europe. As Congress debated the $12.5 billion program in 1948, the communists seized power in Czechoslovakia. That was enough. Congress immediately voted approval of the Marshall Plan. The plan was a spectacular success. It facilitated the rebuilding of Western Europe after the war. Even communist Yugoslavia received aid after it broke away from Soviet domination. Interestingly, Stalin was offered the Marshall Plan as well for the Soviet Union and for those countries in which the Soviets still had troops, but Stalin declined the offer. He did not want to be any part of capitalism and needing aid from the United States. The Berlin Airlift. One of those nations that benefited from the Marshall Plan was West Germany. In 1948, American, British, and French leaders had become convinced that Stalin was not going to allow the reunification of Germany. Therefore, the Western Allies prepared to merge their three occupation zones and create a new nation, the Federal Republic of Germany, better known as West Germany. The western part of Berlin would become part of West Germany as well, an enclave of West Germany within East Germany. The Soviets responded in 1949 by forming a communist state, the German Democratic Republic, or East Germany. Hundreds of thousands of Eastern Europeans left their homes in communist-dominated nations, fled to East Berlin, and then crossed into West Berlin. From there, they booked passage to freedom in the United States, Canada, or Western Europe. Stalin decided to close this escape route by forcing Western powers to abandon West Berlin. When a new German currency was introduced in West Germany, including West Berlin, Stalin considered the new West Berlin as a threat. Stalin blocked Allied access to West Berlin. All shipments to the city through East Germany were banned. The blockade threatened to create severe shortages of food and other supplies needed by the people in West Berlin. U.S. President Truman didn't want to risk starting a war by using military force to open transportation routes. But he didn't want to give up West Berlin to the Soviet Union either. West Berlin's 2.1 million people would run out of food in 5 weeks. Great Britain and the United States chose an airlift. American and British officials flew food and supplies into West Berlin for nearly 11 months. In May 1949, the Soviet Union admitted defeat and lifted the blockade.
The first face-to-face confrontation of the Cold War was in Berlin. Stalin was determined that the Western Allies should leave, and in June of 1948, he cut all the supply lines into the Allied sectors.
It was very tense, and we knew that, and it got tenser and tenser.
West Berliners had enough food to last a few weeks, enough fuel to last only days.
Truman said in meetings in the Oval Office, and he meant it, we stay in Berlin.
You live with the expectation, I did, that we would be going to war with Russia.
The United States were painted and depicted by official propaganda as the greatest enemy, ready at any hour to drop atomic bomb on Russia.
We were close to a Third World War. There were some who were arguing we should leave. It isn't worth it, get out. Why start a Third World War over this city? Others were saying we should send an armored division through and break through by force.
President Truman chose another option. He would supply the beleaguered city by air. It was a gamble. American and British pilots who had once dropped bombs on this city would deliver supplies to Berlin hour after hour, day after day.
We were so busy during the airlift. I was flying 128 hours a month. It's a lot of flying. And we were keeping people alive.
They flew in food and fuel and medicine. They were the lifeline for 2.5 million Berliners. After 11 months, Stalin conceded. Without saying a word, he ended the blockade in May of 1949.
These conflicts marked the start of the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. Again, the Cold War is a struggle over political differences carried on by means short of military action or war. Beginning in 1949, the superpowers used spying, propaganda, diplomacy, and secret operations in their dealings with each other. Much of the world allied with one side or the other. In fact, until the Soviet Union finally broke up in 1991, the Cold War dictated not only U.S. and Soviet foreign policy, but influenced world alliances as well. Superpowers form rival alliances. The Berlin blockade heightened Western Europe's fears of Soviet aggression. As a result, in 1949, 10 Western European nations joined the United States and Canada to form a defensive military alliance. It was called the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO. An attack on any NATO member would be met with armed force by all member nations. This organization still exists today. The Soviet Union saw NATO as a threat and formed its own alliance in 1955. It was called the Warsaw Pact and included the Soviet Union, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and Albania. In 1961, the East Germans built a wall to separate East and West Berlin. The Berlin Wall became the symbol of a world divided into two rival camps.
This nuclear threat over Berlin was diffused, but the Soviet-American confrontation would continue. In October of 1961, the Soviets began building the Berlin Wall. The wall would become a symbol of the Cold War's brutal reality. The newsreels presented Americans with haunting images of people risking their lives to escape communism.
Once a country went communist, it stayed communist. They had secret police and the whole totalitarian structures so that there was no regressing. That the Soviet Union and its allies were a formidable global presence seemed very clear to me.
It's important to note that not every country joined these new alliances. Some, like India, chose not to align with either side. And China, the largest communist country, came to distrust the Soviet Union. It too remained non-allied. The threat of nuclear war. As these alliances were forming, the Cold War threatened to heat up enough to destroy the world. The United States already had atomic bombs. In 1949, just 4 years after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Soviet Union exploded its own atomic weapon. President Truman was determined to develop a more deadly weapon before the Soviets did. He authorized work on a thermonuclear weapon in 1950. The hydrogen or H-bomb would be thousands of times more powerful than the A-bomb. Its power came from fusion or joining together of atoms rather than the splitting of atoms, as in the A-bomb. In 1952, the United States tested the first H-bomb. The Soviets exploded their own in 1953. Dwight D. Eisenhower became president of the United States in 1953. He appointed firmly anti-communist John Foster Dulles as his Secretary of State. If the Soviet Union or its supporters attacked U.S. interests, Dulles threatened the United States would, quote, retaliate instantly by means and at places of our own choosing, end quote. This willingness to go to the brink or the edge of war became known as brinksmanship. Brinksmanship required a reliable source of nuclear weapons and airplanes to deliver them. So the United States strengthened its Air Force and began producing stockpiles of nuclear weapons. The Soviet Union responded with its own military buildup, beginning an arms race that would go on for 4 decades.
Once we knew the Soviets had the atomic bomb in 1949, it then became, once again, a different world.
Now, we could be a target of an atomic attack and did not trust the Russians. And I do remember this, that you always lived day to day with the thought that there could be a nuclear attack on us at any time.
In only 3 years, Americans had gone from buying their first homes to building their first bomb shelters.
And I physically dug out an area underneath that house, right at 6 foot deep, so that the family could at least go there and be below ground level.
The Cold War in the skies. In the 1960s, the skies again were at the source of another superpower conflict. 5 years earlier, Eisenhower proposed the United States and the Soviet Union be able to fly over each other's territory to guard against surprise nuclear attacks. The Soviet Union said no. In response, the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, started secret high-altitude spy flights over Soviet territory in planes called U-2s. In May 1960, the Soviets shot down a U-2 plane, and its pilot, Francis Gary Powers, was captured. This U-2 incident heightened Cold War tensions. The Cold War also affected the science and education programs of the two countries. In August 1957, the Soviets announced the development of a rocket that could travel great distances, an intercontinental ballistic missile, or ICBM. On October 4th, the Soviets used an ICBM to push Sputnik, the first unmanned satellite above the Earth's atmosphere. Americans panicked. They felt they had fallen behind in science and technology, and the government poured money into science education. In 1958, the United States launched its own satellite.
We say, attention, all radio stations of the Soviet Union are broadcasting.
The first artificial Earth satellite in the world has now been created. This first satellite was today successfully launched in the US.
This beep, 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 what is it? Sputnik. Sputnik is around the globe. Who did it? We did it. The Soviet Union. First in the space.
And I can remember going out to my backyard one night, looking up at this bright streak going across the sky, and I felt a sudden sinking feeling, one of almost terror.
Now, suddenly, you've got Soviet missiles that can reach into the Dakotas, can hit Chicago.
With a surprise attack possible for the first time, Americans began to look at the sky differently, now as a place from which terror might reign, and to learn some new terms like duck and cover.
I felt that the threat to America had been increased, that the Soviet Union had upped the ante. While we were playing cops and robbers hide and seek in our backyards and our front yards, there was the gnawing anxiety that it could all end instantaneously.